Alrighty, good. Welcome back. Good to see everybody. So again, reminders that it's not that long until the end of the semester, and it's a good idea to be working on a rough draft of your paper. Even though I'm not requiring rough drafts, I encourage them. It doesn't have to be complete. It can just be even an outline. But I think it's in your best interest to try to get something to me, to get some feedback, just so you have some idea if there are issues that need to be fixed. You've got time to fix them. I think the due date for the paper is our last meeting, so that's coming up pretty quickly, about a week and a half or so. So I encourage you to do that, and also the latest discussion board is out there and on relativism. So the plan is to see how far we can get into naturalized epistemology. We've been talking about that, but there's still a lot of different stuff I think that's worth our time to think about. Questions from you guys before we kind of get back into it? All right, very good. Well, so my recollection is that when last we met, we were thinking about the second half of Chapter 8. I'm kind of doing it out of order. We're going to get to the first half later today, hopefully. But I wanted to do the second half first because that's really sort of the background for understanding what he does in the first half. Not really sure why he chose to do it in that order. I'm sure he had some motivation at the time. Might have just been that a lot of that work on the psychology of human reasoning that was sort of trending at that point in time, if you will. It kind of comes and goes. Philosophy in stages, a lot of times what's popular, what's in fashion or out of fashion. So a lot of that literature was kind of seeping into the world of epistemology around the time that Feldman was working on the book. And so perhaps that's why he decided to do it in that order. But in any case, we were thinking about sort of the historical background a little bit for naturalism, and the locus being Quine's article from 1969 on epistemology naturalized. And I had read some extended quotes. I won't take the time to do that again, but there are a lot of different themes that Quine's got going on in that essay. And again, as far as paper topics, if people are still sort of fishing around for something, you're more than welcome to write on this essay, or another paired essay that makes a good kind of counterpoint is Jaegwon Kim's paper on what is naturalistic epistemology. He raises a number of different objections there, and there's some hard stuff having to do with whether or not naturalistic approaches can also be normative. I haven't said much about that, but one of the main functions of traditional epistemology is to try to give an account, give a theory of justified belief or of rational belief, so that we can assess and appraise whether or not folks are getting close to that ideal or not. That's a kind of evaluation. That's a kind of normative judgment when we're talking about what someone ought to believe or what you should believe, given some conception of rationality. If naturalized epistemology is really just a descriptive endeavor, in other words, if we're just turning epistemology over to psychology, then one question is whether or not there's any normativity left. What can naturalists say about that? So that's something to think about. Feldman doesn't say much about that at all in the chapter. So as a possible paper topic or something to explore, you might look at attempts by naturalists to respond to that worry and see whether you think they're successful. And if you need references for that, I'll be happy to give them to you. So recall the basic idea behind part of what Quine's doing in this landmark paper is he sets up this kind of, it's his version of history, and beginning with what's going on with Carnap and the logical positivist, and they all sort of presuppose a kind of foundationalism. They're empiricists rather than rationalists, and they're certainly no friends to the a priori, a posteriori distinction. Quine himself rejects that earlier in the 50s in a famous paper called Two Dogmas of Empiricism, where he mostly attacks the analytic-synthetic distinction, but ultimately thinks that if that goes down, then the a priori, a posteriori distinction is going to go down as well. Why is that important or relevant? Well, because part of what comes out in the second half of the discussion in Chapter 8 is a kind of back and forth debate over how epistemology ought to be done, what its proper subject matter is, what its proper methodology is there such a thing as the right methodology for thinking about these questions? And to try to help clarify that, Feldman introduces this sort of threefold distinction between a priori knowledge and armchair knowledge and scientific knowledge. And I'll be interested to hear if people have got thoughts on that, what you think of that as a way of conceptualizing and categorizing, trying to get a taxonomy for some of these different questions that epistemologists have asked. So Quine sort of, he gives this kind of account of the goal, the sort of, to be this kind of Cartesian quest for certainty, to be able to provide a kind of foundationalist picture of the structure of our knowledge or justification for believing, and then ultimately to be able to deduce truths about the external world from statements couched entirely in terms of sensory experience along with logic and set theory or whatever else you need. Not that that's going to be a lot of help, perhaps, although maybe building up sets of sensations, kind of bundle theory style approach would be of appeal to empiricists like Carnap, kind of likes that idea. So from there we end up ultimately getting an argument that this is my reconstruction. This is kind of where we ended, I think, last time. What I think of as sort of Quine's main argument, and there are other little ones in there that could be teased out if you needed to. So we can think about this and see what people have to say. So the goals of traditional epistemology, again, all this stuff's kind of up for debate, right? Somebody might say, well, I mean, that's a goal that a traditional epistemologist might have, but it's certainly not, the goals. Traditional epistemologists are different, just like any other group of people. They don't all agree. But in any case, suppose that the main goals are to explicate external world concepts like the concept of body in sensory terms and to deduce truths about the external world from statements couched entirely in sensory terms. Quine then says or asserts, basically argues that none of these goals is attainable. This is his sort of attack on Cartesian foundationalism and that program. If both 1 and 2 are true, then it looks like traditional epistemology is a bankrupt program and should be abandoned. Again, this is my language, and I try to be fair to the spirit of what Quine's after. If the argument turns out to be a lousy argument, then obviously when you're reconstructing someone else's work, that's a thing you have to be aware of, and I encourage you guys to be sensitive to that as well. So when you read an essay and you're trying to find an argument and you want to state it premise conclusion style, which is again something I've encouraged you to do, I like that approach. I just think it makes things really clear. It makes it easy to discuss the arguments and to refer back to individual premises. I'll know what you're doing, and so on. But when you're doing that, you always have to kind of strike a balance between being faithful to the author's original intent, what they're as best you can, right, as you understand it, what the goal of their argument is, but at the same time kind of being charitable. So if you've got something that looks like a pretty bad argument, you might wonder whether there's a way to make it better. And I just put that in as a kind of parenthetical comment about doing this stuff, because it comes up time and again. That's why it's really nice when philosophers actually do give you the argument themselves, stated as premises leading to a conclusion, rather than a lot of prose kind of moving around and sweeping claims and generalities that you then have to kind of figure out what the details are. So it looks like if 1, 2, and 3 are all true, then we can get this intermediate conclusion about the viability of traditional epistemology. And then I just add another kind of a bridge principle here, premise, that if that's true, then all traditional epistemological questions are either meaningless or should be turned over to psychology. And this is language that you get pretty much from Quine. If you read the essay, you can find it in there. So then that gets us our final conclusion. So again, I do my best when reconstructing people's arguments to try to make them well-formed. In other words, make them either deductive arguments or inductive arguments, and try your hardest to put in the missing premises that are the most plausible, so you've got an argument worth considering. So this argument's valid. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. What do people think? Good, not good. I mean, I know what I think about it, but I'd rather hear what you think about it. Yeah, Ian.
So I guess you would, I would tack premise 3 there. It says if 1 and 2 are true, then T in the traditional epistemology is a bankrupt program.
Right.
Because you mentioned that obviously Quine is really leveling the brunt of his assault on Cartesian foundationalism.
Yeah.
And he talks about law school empiricism a little bit as well, but I don't understand how you go from the failure of that and you make the jump to, and that's what obviously that's what that's saying right there, is because the goals of, Cartesian foundationalism, like it's formulated up there, because that fails, what's the connection between the failure of that and the failure of the epistemology's entire field?
It seems really bad, right?
Yeah.
It seems like a bad move.
Because when
Yeah.
you like boil it down into an argument like this,
Yeah.
and get rid of all the prose, what he's saying, like Feldman says, is he's going from the failure of Cartesian foundationalism and from that saying that epistemology is no good anymore. And it doesn't follow. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Excellent. Thanks. I appreciate your comments here. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Of course, I'm kind of putting all my cards out there on the table. This is stuff that I've worked on my dissertation on, and so I've spent some time thinking about it and trying to figure out if there are some better ways to reconstruct this argument, or what else is going on in Quine. And it is a kind of curious thing that he seems to make this leap, because whatever you think about the viability of classical foundationalism a la Descartes, or Carnap's heroic efforts, as Quine puts it, he says that Carnap made heroic efforts on the side of the classical approach, an empiricist version of the classical approach. Whatever you think about all of that, I'm with Ian in thinking that nothing follows about epistemology in general. I mean, unless this is the only, it's the Cartesian way, or there's no way at all. And we've already seen, when we talked about internalist approaches, that modest foundationalism or moderate foundationalism seems to provide a kind of picture, a viable, plausible account. The details are important, and I'm not taking it for granted that moderate foundationalism is out of the woods, but it certainly seems like once you give up the idea that the basic beliefs have to be, indubitable or epistemically certain, or impossible for you to be mistaken about, however you want to put it, once we abandon that part of what makes a foundational belief basic, and then we abandon this idea of being able to deduce all of our science. Quine likes to think about it in terms of science, but really just our belief, even what Feldman would call armchair beliefs, that you're in a room with other people. Once you give those two things up, it seems to me that a lot of the wind is taken out of this argument. Yeah.
And I was thinking about this because this seems like a really strange thing to say, not really law school. I was thinking that maybe he wrote the paper is just to be provocative and try to open up a new field and investigate, get people to think about it, as opposed to like something like a foolproof, attempt at really getting naturalized epistemology off the ground. He's just trying to get people to think about it. Right.
Yeah, and I think that's fair too. I mean, it's certainly in keeping with some of the spirit of a lot of Quine's work. I mean, he is remembered for a number of fairly provocative ideas. So among those are that are associated with him, this idea of the indeterminacy of translation and the inscrutability of reference. Those are two sort of slogan-y kind of ideas that really are not totally connected with what he's doing in terms of naturalized epistemology, but he likes to reference himself too. So it does ultimately get into the essay there. And I think that's fair, that he's, is it fun to think about alternative approaches or a different, conception of epistemology? Would that provoke a new research program or get people to go and explore different directions? That seems fair enough. But I think one concern I have as a traditional epistemologist is just making sure that there's still a place for traditional epistemology. Some conception of it is viable. I mean, I take it that what we've been doing all semester long and working through the standard view is just that, a very traditional approach. So we've tried to give an analysis of knowledge, and we got as far as seeing that there's going to have to be a fourth condition to get around Gettier. That didn't take any kind of scientific investigation for us to arrive at that result. We've thought hard about the concept of epistemic justification and whether or not that should be analyzed in an evidentialist way in terms of internally accessible, or at least available to reflective access or reflective awareness, one's evidence, or whether it ought to be, the concept ought to be analyzed as a kind of externalist notion, having to do with causal connections or truth tracking or reliability or proper function. All of that work it's very, very much in the spirit and the vein of what's gone on under the heading of epistemology. This idea of there even being a distinction between traditional epistemology and naturalism is something that came about in part because of this essay. Prior to this, it was all sort of traditional epistemology. Now, Phil Kitcher has an influential paper. It's part of the kind of core, bibliography that you'd want to read if you were going to go very deep into this. He has a paper called The Naturalist's Return, where he tries, and he's a historian of philosophy as well as a practitioner. He tries to make and he's a sympathizer. He's a naturalist himself of a certain stripe. He's not Aquinian, but he's sympathetic. And he tries to make the case that if you go back and look at the early moderns, so if you look at people like, especially empiricists, so people like Locke, for example, or Hume, Hobbes, that there you're gonna see a take on doing epistemology that's actually much more in tune with science and interested in trying to appeal to the science of the day, what they knew at the time about how the mind worked. And so he sort of challenges this idea, and I'm not a historian of the period, so it's hard for me to weigh in on that. But it's a curious thing that Kitcher makes that point about all this. But I agree with Ian here that I just think that and I have to kind of take some credit for this if this is a kind of a caricature of Klein's argument. But in reading the essay a lot, it's hard for me to see that this is too far off. It does seem to be what he's after. And it's also difficult to see why it turns out that the questions are if they can't be investigated by using psychology, and it's hard to know exactly what Klein even means by psychology. He doesn't really say much. He describes the stimulation of a person's sensory receptors as the only evidence anyone has in forming his or her conception or picture of the world. So why not just study that connection? And we have areas that do. So I guess psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, maybe linguistics would be areas that look into the actual mechanisms whereby we form beliefs. But that's a far cry from what we've been doing up to this point, which is some really general, high-level, abstract kinds of questions, namely, what is knowledge? To me, that's a request for a kind of definition, not a lexical definition, not something from the dictionary, but a philosophically illuminating definition, if you will, one that is meant to be a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, so it would hold in all possible worlds. So right off the bat, the relevance of what could well turn out to be contingent facts about how human beings happen to go about getting knowledge of their world is just going to be one case. We're going to have to consider other possible worlds or possible scenarios where maybe the beings in question aren't human, and they don't have the same kind of sensory setup that we have, or nervous systems that work like ours. Presumably, and again, there's room for debate, even among traditionalists on this. I think maybe I'm a little further out than some in really wanting an analysis of the core epistemic concepts like knowledge, justification, rationality. I'd really like the analysis of those things to provide us with a set of necessary truths about those concepts, in part because I don't think of what epistemologists are doing or what philosophers in general are typically doing as being science. If you look at the actual practice of philosophers, now there are philosophers that will dispute this, and there are folks out there that do interdisciplinary work. Alvin Goldman is an example of somebody that we've talked about before. And his book, I think in 1982, 82 or 84, he published a book called Epistemology and Cognition. It's a big book. And he was sort of inspired by Quine. He's taking up this kind of Quinean call to arms to let's rethink what we've been doing in epistemology all along, and why not make use of the latest science, the science of the day, to try to bring a little bit more tractability to these epistemological questions. And you can see the frustration. I mean, I get it. I get the argument. Science seems to make lots of progress. Now, it also finds out that a lot of what it thought was knowledge turned out not to be. That's just the nature of the scientific enterprise. You have theories, and you test them, you try to predict and explain, and then you look back to see whether the theory needs to be adjusted or tweaked. Sometimes theories have to just be completely jettisoned altogether. And that's the way science makes progress, and we've got lots of examples of that. I mean, you've got a smartphone, right? We've got a space shuttle, we've got particle accelerators. These are all great technical accomplishments that science has made possible. So why wouldn't it be great if we could to make that kind of progress on the philosophical front? And you don't have to have studied philosophy for very long in very many different contexts to probably pick up on the fact that philosophical results are tough to come by, in the sense of getting consensus and having all the experts agree. It's part of either what makes the field really interesting to you if you like it, or really frustrates you if you don't. So I understand the sort of longing for more progress, and why can't we solve the Gettier problem? Why can't we get internalists and externalists about justification to sit down at the table and agree and just solve this once and for all? That may not happen. I think it's just in part the nature of the subject matter. It just doesn't seem to lend itself to, in part because there isn't an empirical component there. So for me, the main questions, and this takes us to, if you've got your book, over on 167, starting there, Feldman, and I should have typed this up so I could project it for us, but I didn't. He lists a number of claims. So N1, and then over a couple pages later, N2. So here are some different naturalistic claims. The first one, philosophical thinking about knowledge should be abandoned in favor of the empirical study of how people actually go about forming their beliefs. So this is one of Quine's big insights, and Feldman ultimately, pretty quickly dispatches that and says, well, if that's supposed to be something that we get from this argument, then looks like it's no good. Looks like we've got a response there. There's not any real challenge or any threat to traditional epistemology on that front. Then he goes over and he talks a little bit about whether or not epistemological questions can be answered a priori on 168. And he's got a second naturalistic claim, 169. Traditional epistemologists have discussed and defended their views without making adequate use of scientific information about how our minds work. So I'm trying to figure out what exactly, how's that supposed to work? What is it that we need to know? So Goldman, again, in Epistemology and Cognition, a great example of this, the first half of the book is pretty much just straightforward conceptual analysis. And by that I mean he's doing what looks to be kind of a priori style philosophy. He's thinking about the concept of justification, and he comes up with the idea that it should be understood or can be analyzed in terms of reliability, and he starts to build his theory, his process reliabilism, that a belief's justified for a person if and only if the belief is caused by a reliable belief forming process. And we've talked some about reliability and the generality problem and some of the issues that come up. And he's very concerned after that. I mean, after sort of articulating and defending the theory and all these little details and twists and turns, he wants to be able to get the intuitions about the cases right. That's again, very much kind of armchair, if you will. I mean, we'll talk about how Feldman's understanding that, but by being able to do it from the armchair, all I mean is that we don't have to go into the labs and do any kind of research, empirical research. You've got cases like Norman, the clairvoyant, right, who's perfectly reliable in forming these beliefs about things that he has absolutely no evidence for thinking are true. That looks like a counterexample. You've got the case of the person who's being deceived by the evil demon. And so none of their beliefs are reliably produced, and yet an intuition that a lot of folks have is that the person, if they have no reason for thinking that they're being deceived, then their beliefs are justified. And it's a curious fact that Goldman doesn't just sort of swipe that aside and say, but let me show you all this cool cognitive science about how the brain works and how we, how the systems are processing the information. He spends a lot of time trying to come up with nuanced philosophical responses to these objections to his theory. Again, all done just completely the way Feldman's been doing things, the way we've been doing things. So it's kind of it's a weird thing. Now, in the second half of the book, he then does go into, he launches into all this different discussions, chapter after chapter, about cognitive science and what cognitive science is showing us about how vision works, or how our auditory system works, how the brain's able to compute the information that it receives and build a kind of picture of things, how people develop and form concepts, all this interesting stuff that's science, but it doesn't really connect up with any of what's been done in the first half of the book. So it's an unusual, and I think a lot of the stuff that naturalists do when they try to use the results of science, or they try to incorporate insights from the sciences, it often feels that way. It just feels like it's kind of out of sync with what the original questions were. Now, here's the thing. I mean, there's lots of different questions, and so they're the one. I try to identify some that I think have been of interest to traditionalists. So the real, Socratic type questions. What is knowledge? What is justified belief? Can we ever really know anything? And we looked at skepticism for a long time and thought about that. Are there general rules or principles that we can come up with, that we can formulate about rationality, so that we can do better, try to improve our cognitive situation? All of those are questions that I'm interested in as a traditionalist. And, if there's some relevance of empirical input to answering those questions, then I'm all ears. But as I say, a lot of times what seems to be happening is when naturalists do try to use the results of empirical work from other areas, it seems to me like they're just talking about a different topic. They've sort of switched the subject, they've changed the subject. And that's a worry, because that doesn't show that there's anything wrong with these original questions, even if they can't be approached in the way that Quine urges us to. So that's over on the next page on 170. He's got some different claims there, E1 through E4. And it's fun to think about these, because you think about the first one here: people have a great deal of knowledge of the world around them, including some knowledge of the past, their current surroundings, the future, morality, mathematics, and so on. That's one claim. Some of our main sources of knowledge are perception, memory, introspection, testimony, and rational insights. So this is basically just two tenets of the standard view. That in general, we start off with this idea that we can begin by let's take it for granted that we know a lot in these different categories, these different areas of knowledge, and that our main sources of how we get this knowledge are the ones he lists. We've talked about that in the very beginning. Then the next two claims, knowledge requires justified true belief that doesn't essentially depend upon a falsehood, and a person's justified in believing a proposition when the belief fits the believer's evidence. So one question then is, what's the status of those claims? Are these supposed to be a priori knowable? Are they a posteriori? Are they necessary truths? Are they statements or answers to these things? Are these statements themselves, are they intended to express necessary truths that are true in all possible worlds for all putative knowers? Or are they contingent truths about the way human beings are here locally? What do people think? So he has this distinction, right, between the a priori and the armchair and the scientific. And the a priori, just so we're all clear, is supposed to be what? Anybody want to say? What does it mean for, say, a statement to be a priori?
Before observation.
Yeah. Anybody want to add some more?
It's a priori is completely pure philosophy. It's completely rational. It's
Pure reason.
pure reason. That's what I mean.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, and again, this has become one of those sort of sticking points. It's even kind of filtered into other areas outside of epistemology, and I kind of blame naturalists in part for that. I mean, it's a horrible thing to say maybe, but it's started to seep into philosophy of science and philosophy of language and philosophy of mind. There have been attempts to try to ground an ethical theory or build an ethical theory in a naturalistically acceptable way. A lot of discussion of meaning, naturalistic theories of meaning. So it's not just epistemology, though I think we can, again, kind of cite Quine as one of the people who got folks excited about this idea. Yeah.
Going back to Kant, I think he had something interesting to say about this, because you look at what's called groundwork for some metaphysics and morals, I think, and he says that you can't mix these different fields. Like, you have to isolate pure philosophy, and you have to take any empirical considerations and separate the two.
Right.
You have to look at things we can get through pure reason alone, is how he says. And another thing he says is, for some philosophical problems, like trying to find moral laws, for example, you can't look at contingent empirical human conditions to derive absolute moral laws. It's something that has to be done by pure reason alone. So in the same way, I think that for some of these things, it's just you can't look at the human conditions and empirical considerations like that to do some of these, to consider some of these questions.
Thanks. Yeah, no, thanks, Ian. I appreciate it. I agree with you. I mean, we're patting each other on the back today. You know, we're preaching to the choir, sort of, kind of. And that's all right. You know, self-congratulations isn't all bad. So yeah, I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying. I mean, are there folks here that are? I mean, I'd like to hear what other people think too, though, in terms of if somebody thinks there's something good in terms of there's some need for the use of empirical insights into trying to answer these original epistemological questions. I'm not saying that the empirical insights aren't useful and good to know. I mean, the work in the psychology of human reasoning, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. I mean, that's really interesting, fascinating stuff to think about. But whether or not we can get very much from it in terms of drawing, larger philosophical conclusions, or whether or not knowing that literature is going to help us answer the original set of questions, I'm skeptical. I'm doubtful that there's a lot there. Again, it seems like to me they either they're answering a different question, or it's just not all that helpful. I can see, part of Quine's push to sort of say, well, look, if the questions can't be addressed scientifically vis-a-vis this new way of thinking about epistemology, so-called naturalized epistemology, then the questions are probably something we should take a second look at. They're probably not legitimate. They're meaningless, or they seem like they're posing real questions, but they're really not somehow. That to me is all his sympathies again with kind of verificationism. The idea that meaning ultimately has to be codified and rest in sensory experience and what can ultimately be sort of tested and observed, at least. So as far as these 4 different claims and how to think about them, I guess I agree with Feldman that as a fan of traditional epistemology, I don't take it for granted that I don't think we can know a priori that we've got knowledge of the world. That seems pretty clear. I mean, our knowledge of the world is largely knowledge of contingent facts. There'll be some exceptions. The sciences, in an effort to understand and unravel the microstructure of reality, will give us results like water is H2O. You'll get things like that. That'll be a necessary truth. And it took some empirical work to get it, right? That's a discovery. That's a chemical discovery made possible through chemistry. So that's not something you couldn't have known that water is H2O a priori. But part of that is because the meaning of water isn't H2O. That's its chemical composition. But water plausibly means something like watery stuff with a bunch of other associated descriptive content, I think. So, yeah, they're going to be, now as far as like the water being H2O being expressing a necessary truth, that there's sort of 2 stages to getting that one. You first have to have the actual empirical work. Somebody has to do that investigative work. And then the way we arrive at it being a necessary truth is via a philosophical argument, namely that all identities are necessities. And there are people that have tried to dispute that and argued for contingent identity. I don't find it very compelling. But the point is just that in making observations of the world around us, these are typically going to turn out to be contingent local truths. I mean, they're interesting and we need it for scientific progress. But how that's going to help us if our goal is to try to answer these what is X questions, these kind of Socratic questions, they seem to me to be of kind of limited help to spend a lot of time focusing on empirical investigation. So I think what Feldman says here is right, and my take on it is that if there are traditional epistemologists, like he uses Moore as an example, and Moore's defense of common sense, right? The idea that, look, I'm more certain of this conclusion, the skeptical conclusion, being false than I am justified in believing any of the premises of the argument. So, okay, yeah, we can get rid of, that's one approach. That's Moore's kind of common sense approach. Now, whether Moore thought that he could know a priori common sense facts about the world, I think that's debatable. I would think not. But in any case, if there are traditionalists who have claimed that we can know certain aspects of the standard view to be true a priori, then I agree. I think that's a mistake. But I think we have to separate out carefully what the different questions are asking us for. So a question like what is knowledge or what is justification, to me, is a request for a set of logically necessary and sufficient conditions, and the resulting theory should express a necessary truth. Now, if you're somebody like Quine who doesn't like necessity to start with, he's critical of modality, he doesn't like modal logic, then obviously he's not interested in that program. That's okay. It doesn't mean it's a bankrupt program if the questions are meaningless. It just means maybe he needs to do something different. That's the way I sort of look at it. More, and the same with the a priori. I mean, he's got an axe to grind against the analytic synthetic, and he thinks that's going to take down the a priori distinction as a posteriori as well. I don't see it myself, and at least in terms of the work we've done up to this point in thinking about these epistemological questions, it seems like to me it's been conducted a priori. We've just been thinking about it. You just sit around and think about it really hard and see if you can come up with counterexamples. And then if you do, and you think that your intuitions confirm that it's a counterexample, then you go back and you adjust the theory. Try to work around those counterexamples. But these are thought experiments. They're not real world experiments. So I think that E3 and E4, those two claims, strike me as things that are knowable a priori if they're right. Now, as far as these other things that people have a great deal of knowledge of the sorts and the categories he mentions, or the main sources are what they are, that's something that's, I think, is armchair knowledge as he describes it. So armchair knowledge is basically a posteriori knowledge. It's knowledge that requires some observations be made. It can't be just known by pure reason alone, unaided, or by reflection. You have to have had some experience of the world to get it. That seems right to me. But and certainly, you don't want to go too far here and throwing the baby out with the bathwater, just because some of the claims of traditional epistemologists are going to be a posteriori. Sure, but they can be made from the armchair. They didn't require detailed scientific investigation for us to know them. So I think that's an important. And again, I don't think that we know a priori that the skeptics are wrong. I would never want to be in that position having to defend that view. I take skepticism seriously. It worries me that we don't have better responses to some of the arguments. I think fallibilism and modest foundationalism provide, and inference to the best explanation, provide, a kind of three-pronged approach to trying to mitigate some of the worries that come up in connection with skepticism, but it's not an open and shut case. I mean, it's always available to skeptics to challenge, and they do. They'll want the details of how immediate perceptual justification works. They're going to want to know, are we really, as justified as even fallibilist standards say we need to be? So all of those are open questions. I don't know if folks have other thoughts about any of this part of the chapter. I'm happy to think about them. There's a paper by a philosopher that I like a lot named George Beeler on the autonomy and authority of philosophy. He's written a lot on scientific essentialism as well. Scientific essentialism is the idea that at least some scientific discoveries are going to be discoveries into natural kinds, and that things are going to have certain properties, essentially, and these can only be discovered scientifically, like the essential features of these things. So water, for example, is maybe essentially hydrogen and oxygen bound together in that way. That's an empirical discovery. Beeler's written a fair amount on whether or not scientific essentialism provides any kind of barrier to traditional philosophical analysis generally, not just epistemology, but in general. So if you're interested in these questions of the proper role of philosophy, the authority, the autonomy of it to conduct its kind of inquiry without really worrying about what the sciences are telling us, then that's some material you might want to look at. It's interesting. It's also still kind of relevant because metaphilosophy has become a subject that folks have gotten really interested in. So David Chalmers, among others, has written on this topic of the proper method for doing philosophy. So now we've got people debating that. And also, and in metaphysics as well, metametaphysics. Yeah.
This is another thing I think would be interesting to think about is why don't you actually grab scientists from the field we're talking about here, like psychologists or cognitive scientists, and try to bring them, because like this stuff right here, try to introduce them to some of these epistemological questions and see what they have to say and see if, like, the way I'm looking at it now is just, philosophers talking about it, and if you actually get the scientists and introduce them to the basics of the stuff and see if what they're actually doing, because they have a deep knowledge into this, and see if they could say, oh, well, I'm doing this investigation and so and so, and maybe this could shed some light onto it. And I wonder if that has been done in the past, because it seems to me like that would be
useful.
Obvious thing to do, considering what we're talking about.
Yeah. No, and I mean, there are folks, I mean, there's areas like evolutionary epistemology. There have been some folks that have worked in that, Karl Popper and Donald Campbell. There are people doing so-called experimental epistemology, but again, it doesn't look, it sounds a little more glamorous than the reality turns out to be. Again, it's very tough because it seems, and I'm with you in thinking that, yeah, if we're going to be having these debates, then it needs to kind of be an interdisciplinary thing. We need to have more than just philosophers involved, have folks from the special sciences that know their respective areas of study be party to the discussion and see if they've got something to contribute. And I don't know how it would turn out. I mean, in my experience with reading the material, the literature, again, you can kind of tell where they're doing philosophy and where they're doing science. And it's very hard to see how even though each area is interesting in its own right, how the results from the one area are going to help us understand the other area. And you can see this happening. Just to get it out of the realm of epistemology and philosophy of mind, this is a kind of problem. I mentioned David Chalmers. He's written on this before, the so-called hard problem of consciousness. And we know more now than ever about the brain and how the brain works, and some fascinating stuff, right? Neuroscience is making a lot of progress on a whole bunch of different fronts there. And so you might think, well, that's all really relevant to the mind-body problem. But honestly, after looking at a lot of the interesting scientific literature, the articles and the kind of results in the case of consciousness studies or neuroscience, so we find out a whole bunch of interesting stuff about the hippocampus or the amygdala and circuitry and parts of the brain that most people don't even know they've got. And that all of that wiring and all of that chemical electrical activity is presumably either what consciousness is or it's giving rise to consciousness in an emergent sort of way. Okay, but how does that help us understand why the sensation of seeing a red apple has the qualitative character that it does? Or why a certain memory or a certain smell has the associated character, feels the way that it does to the subject that's having the experience, has the various connections to other phenomenal aspects of their experience. It doesn't seem like we really get, again, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not a cognitive scientist or a psychologist who studies human reasoning, but I have talked with folks that do work in these areas, and we have some interesting discussions. I always learn a lot about their field. But again, in the case of the mind-body problem, I don't know. I mean, have we made a lot of progress on the original hard problem, as Chalmers calls it? I mean, the hard problem is the one of trying to explain why consciousness exists at all. Why is it that this collection of physical states has associated with it something that it feels like to be in that state, that there's sentience or that there's awareness. These are the questions that philosophers of mind have traditionally wanted answers to, and that's what sort of initially kind of motivates Descartes' inquiries into what sort of a thing am I? Am I a mind or a body or some combination of the two? So again, I'm with Ian and I guess others in echoing an interest in seeing if we can make some headway with any of these ideas about interdisciplinary work, but I'm somewhat skeptical, I guess. All right, so on to a sort of a second kind of thing here. This is the stuff on irrationality, human irrationality, that gets discussed in the first half of the chapter. And again, this is still material that's relevant. People are interested in this. And trying to put it all together is challenging. I mean, exactly what's naturalistic about any of this? Well, I guess the idea is that since the 60s, there's been a fairly steady stream of empirical work coming mostly from psychology and cognitive science, suggesting that maybe people aren't as rational as some people thought we were. I mean, it's hard to even know without the quantifiers, like who thinks these things and who are the players in the game. Aristotle famously says man is a rational animal. And, certainly you can find examples of philosophers who have overreached and were a little bit too optimistic maybe about the ability of human beings to be these idealized, rational agents. I think you think of like caricatures of this like Mr. Spock or Commander Data or some, superior form of AI that doesn't have all the built-in limitations that we have, whether it's computational power or processing power, or the biases that are part of us as the human beings that we are. You might, there might be people that hold those ideals up as what rationality is all about, but again, for my interest in this, it's about kind of trying to understand what would count as having a rationally justified belief or an unjustified belief, and so it's just going to come back to evidence. So there are Feldman discusses three different kinds of studies here. So there's this Wason selection task, the conjunction fallacy, and then armchair statistical inferences. So the first one here on conditionals, and I think he asked you, right, to try to answer the question before you move on. Did people get this right? I'm hoping everybody here got it right. You're the philosophy students, so you should know, right, about conditionals. So which of the following cards must be turned over in order to evaluate the following conditional? If a card has a vowel on the front side, then it has an even number on the other side. And it turns out, I don't have the data right to mind at this point, but a lot of people mess this up. People get it wrong. So a lot of folks only say you need to turn over card number 1 or card number 3, but it turns out you need 1 and 4. So 1 has a vowel on the front, and you need to flip that over to see whether or not it's got an even number on the other side. And card 4 has an odd number on it, and so we'd want to look and see what's on the other side of that, because if it's a vowel, then that's going to falsify the rule. So, again, what to make of this? Human beings and conditional reasoning. It's worrisome. Does it demonstrate widespread irrationality? Is this an example of an empirical insight somehow being relevant to thinking about the concept of justification as just the core concept? I'm not sure. Yeah, Ian?
Like I said, my problem with it is how you get the systemic irrationality part from the failure of this experiment. Another thing is, I was thinking about this, like if you conduct an experiment and you just tell people to do this task and there's nothing really hinging on whether they do it correctly. Like I bet you if you put a gun to someone's head and said, if you do not get this problem right, then we're going to kill you,
Yeah.
Instead of just
That's a bad test. That's one you couldn't get past the IRB, right? The Internal Review Board wouldn't.
If anyone sat down for this and actually looked at it and thought about what the question was asking for 20 minutes, you could work your way around, even if you're below average intelligence. If you sat here and really thought about this kind of thing, it's not hard to work out the conditional part of it to see what you need to do. So what I'm trying to say is that
maybe people didn't take it seriously,
or
okay.
It's not really. You're not taking advantage of their entire potential for reasoning.
Okay.
You're just doing this experiment. So, like I said, if you even gave like $100 monetary incentive to do this, they would make you
try harder,
rationality better, and then consequently get the question right.
Thanks.
It's not a hard question if you really thought about it.
Yeah, it's amazing though. I mean, again, I wish I should have looked at it before class to see what the statistics were on it. But people, it's pretty robust, the result, in terms of the number of folks that get this stuff wrong, which is really sad because conditionals are kind of the foundations of reasoning. And if you're going to take like the GRE or the LSAT or the MCAT or any of these advanced tests to go on in higher education to graduate work, there's going to be a logical reasoning section on there. It's just full of this kind of stuff. So, it's nice to know philosophy students tend to do better. That should make you all feel good. And be sure to tell your parents that too. And a good justification for why philosophy. So as philosophers, we do tend to do a little better on this, which is heartening. But I'm with you, Ian, in thinking. I mean, there are a lot of different explanations and things that kind of come to mind. I mean, how seriously are the study participants taking any of this stuff? How are they selected? In most cases, they're college kids, so you guys are the study subjects. These are trials that are run on students at large universities because they're free subjects. They have to do it as part of their participation, and it's part of the lab for one of their psych classes or something. I want to get to Aaron and then Corey. I saw hands earlier. Yeah.
I agree with what he said a lot. That probably most of it is just that it hasn't been fully thought through. But I'm also tempted to say that if we don't live in this abstract world, this is strictly just conceptual. We think of things more in images, which is why the bartender example is why I think it said it had a higher statistical success rate. So I think just that we're not used to thinking through this is purely abstract.
Yeah, it's got no relevance, right? I mean, you've got letters and numbers on cards, and it's not. So there's a good reason for thinking when you make the conditional question and the study setup more relevant to real life, people do better. So there's definitely. I mean, I think that's again good stuff to kind of keep in mind when you're trying to draw conclusions about all this. Like, what does this show? Yeah, Corey?
I was going to say exactly. I thought this one was more of an abstract thing because there's a couple ways to break it, whereas the bartender one, I think,
Okay. Yeah. Let me show another one here. So that's the so-called Wason selection task. How about this one? This is the conjunction problem. So here's the setup, right? Linda's a 31-year-old single, outspoken, and very bright woman. She majored in philosophy in college, and she was heavily involved in issues concerning discrimination and social justice, ranked in order of probability that they're true the following statements. So we've got Linda is active in the feminist movement, and Linda is a bank teller, and then that she's both of those things. And it turns out that people pick C. Now, that can't be according to the rules of the probability calculus, because the probability of a conjunction has to be equal or less than any of its conjuncts. So it's never going to be more likely that she's both than that she's one or the other. And so again, puzzles here. Feldman has a nice discussion, I think, where he talks about, he uses that example of which is the better ending to the story. Suppose this were part of a story and you're watching a movie or whatever, and you have to pick, you've got a choice between two different endings about how Linda's life is going to go on after college. Which ending would you rather believe, or would you find more compelling? If that's the way to understand how people are thinking about the question, then maybe this isn't evidence of irrationality. I think that, in the case of the conditional reasoning there, we just need to do a better job earlier on with critical thinking in K through 12 and try to introduce people to the basics of modus ponens and modus tollens, and then affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent, so that they can become better reasoners with conditionals. Yeah.
And this question is concerning the rule of probability, like you mentioned. Okay, so this shows that people are ignorant of certain rule of probability, which is that evidence of, okay, this person is systemically irrational, because you can rectify that by teaching them the rule, and then they no longer...
Yeah, they get out of that.
It's a simple rule. It's easy to understand. It's laid out.
Yeah.
So because they're ignorant of this certain rule, I don't understand necessarily follows
that they're irrational or unjustified. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah.
I think it's to see to be replaced with all of the above, and so when people look at a question like this, they think that C is a safer choice because it's inclusive of both the answers.
Okay.
And so by throwing it in there as writing it out like that, people would read it as a collective.
Yeah, it's sort of like all of the above.
Yeah.
It's the answer D or E or whatever in the multiple choice thing. Yeah, and I also think there's a case to be made that the use of the word probable it's just difficult. It's just a sticky one because there's a whole area of philosophy on the philosophy of probability, and there's different conceptions of probability. There are frequentist interpretations of probability, and then there are various, subjective interpretations, Bayesian interpretations. Let's be real. People aren't walking around with the rules of the axioms of probability calculus in their head. I mean, unless you're a really unusual person that's your area or something. So, it's not surprising. Again, with Ian, it's not clear that the fact that people get this wrong is evidence of irrationality, unless you want to make some assumptions about the fact that the probability rules are part of everyone's evidence, whether they have been taught those things or not, because they're necessary truths or whatever. I'm not really comfortable with that. I mean, I think there's what your evidence is, and it might be misleading in some cases. So you might be being rational, following your total evidence, turn out to get it wrong. The fact that you're getting it wrong that's not evidence of irrationality automatically. What's evidence of irrationality is if you're believing something that's not supported by your evidence. But there's no guarantee that your evidence is going to be truth conducive. People can have incomplete evidence. They can have misleading evidence. But it's still your evidence, and that's all you've got to go on. And again, if you sit down and you teach people these rules and say, oh, here's why you missed this one, but in the future, whenever you're doing something involving the probability of conjunctions, just keep in mind that it's never going to be greater. So I think that, again, it's hard to know what to think about the conjunction problem. The last one here is one involving memory, salience and memory, ability to recall things, it seems like. So armchair statistical inference. Suppose a word's chosen at random from the dictionary, rank in order the probability from most probable to least. And it turns out, not too surprisingly, that people find it easier to think of words that have the letter at the beginning than in the third position. It's not real surprising. I mean, it is hard because you have to sort of start, it's more work, cognitively speaking. And so if they can recall more where these letters are the beginning of the word, then they're going to estimate that there are more of them. So they're going to get it wrong. It turns out that there's actually more probable that it'll be the third position. All right. So based on these, we get these arguments. Here's the people are irrational argument that sort of starts all this off. So people frequently give incorrect or unreasonable answers to questions such as those just described. If that's true, then people are significantly irrational, so people are significantly irrational. Now, right off the bat, one worry I have is that, and I encourage you to be careful of this in your reconstructions and papers and in writing in general, when we're missing quantifiers. We don't know how, all people, most people, college-educated people, males, females, where in the world are they? Are there cultural considerations? We don't know what counts as significant irrationality either. How many people would have to be irrational, how much of the time for rationality to be a widespread issue? I mean, part of this debate is whether or not irrationality can be empirically demonstrated. And I always found it kind of, there's a bunch of nice literature on this stuff, but kind of humorous that's really a question. It just seems to me like, yeah, clearly there's lots of irrationality, but I'm not thinking about it in terms of these experimental setups where people get the wrong results to kind of artificial questions that might involve them having to know actual formal rules for figuring out answers. I'm thinking about just living life and everyday life. You see people being irrational by not following their evidence. There's lots of wishful thinking. There's lots of overconfidence. There's lots of people just paying attention to the parts of their evidence that confirm what they want to believe. There are a lot of folks that seem not at all concerned really with their evidence. So it was interesting to me that when this started to kind of become a big thing in the field, people were writing a lot about it. that's even a question that's up for much debate. But again, this is me revealing some of my own biases, perhaps, and thinking about things from an evidentialist standpoint. It'd be great if people did follow their evidence to the end and considered the total evidence. But we know that human beings are finite, limited, fallible creatures, and we have all kinds of other things that affect why we believe what we believe. And that's where the psychology can be helpful, perhaps. I mean, it can identify certain biases. Yeah.
Thinking right now, so buying a lottery ticket,
Mm-hmm.
like you look at it and say that's really irrational because the chances of you winning are, I don't know,
1 in a million.
Yeah. It's really rough. But what if the person, their total evidence is like they accept that, like they understand that,
Mm-hmm.
but they still do it anyway? Would that still be considered irrational?
So is this specifically about the rationality of buying lottery tickets once you're aware of the odds?
Yeah.
I mean, my personal view, I don't play the lottery, but I mean, I have a lot of friends and family that do. I mean, people's attitudes seem to be, what's the harm in playing? I mean, it's $1 for a chance to win some ridiculous. But actually, I don't know enough about lotteries. You could probably help me out here in terms of how much you're willing to pay for the chance to win X amount of money. But I don't gamble either. I don't lose money in Vegas because that's not a place I ever go. So
I guess what I'm getting at is that is it irrational if they understand the rules of the
what
game?
the odds are?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like their total evidence supports like they understand
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. What do you think?
I mean, irrationality to me is like going against what you should, like what your evidence leads you in the direction of what you should do, and you go against that because for some, obvious reason.
Let me get Aaron, and then I'll chirp in on it. And see. I got something to say back, but
Well, we don't know if the reason they're buying a lottery ticket is with the expectation that they'll win. Like they might just be doing it as part of the game routine, or if it's a tradition with family, so we feel it together.
yeah.
So like there could be reasons that are not at the scheme that they accept the likelihood is not great that they'll win, but they're doing it for like not at scheme reasons.
Good. Yeah, Susie.
Another reason might be that even though they know their personal chances of winning are like really, really slim, they know that someone is going to win it, so they're still in that chance.
Yeah. So there's this. Somebody's got to win, and you can't win if you don't play. So why not me? I can be the winner. Yeah. So there's some of the optimistic kind of thing. I mean, I was going to say back to. I mean, I think all that stuff's right. So thanks. I think some of it too. Maybe it's helpful to distinguish between. Is their behavior irrational or are their beliefs irrational? So, because we can talk about what would be a rational action, and what would be a rational belief to have. Suppose you buy the lottery ticket and somebody asks you, do you think you're justified in believing that your ticket's the winner? And the person says, yeah, I am. I'm totally. Then that person's irrational. Presumably, if they know the odds, then they know that there's a minuscule chance. They're more likely to get hit by lightning 3 times, on 3 separate occasions, than to ever, win the lottery. So I think given that they know that, if their belief is that they're holding the winning ticket, then I think then we can kind of indict them on evidentialist grounds for not paying attention to the total evidence. On the other hand, would there ever be, or could there ever be a case where it would be, as a matter of practicality or of action, acceptable for a person to do something even though they have the belief that this isn't the winner? They're still buying that because we're evaluating the behavior at that point. So like people are saying, why are they buying these tickets? For some people, it's just a fun thing. They get together with their friends. It gives them something to get excited about and look forward to. So there are a lot of other side benefits that are kind of not connected with really believing they're getting the winning ticket. Yeah.
So I was wondering whether or not, if you think about like an addict or something, is that behavior
Irrational
because, like you said, you made that distinction between. Because I was thinking like maybe instead of looking at these weird like concocted experiments, you could like try to step back and look at irrational, what knee-jerk, you consider irrational behavior from
Right.
like an actual stand, like see how many smokers there are, because you would say maybe that's irrational behavior, but.
Right. That's a good example,
But
too.
then again, it's irrational behavior, but perhaps they understand that this is damaging and it's not the best thing to do, but they're
It's a risk they're willing to take. It's a calculated risk for some of these folks, if they've given it that much thought, maybe. Or maybe you sort of you say to them, I mean, maybe don't confront anybody in the smoker circle with this thing. Wouldn't go over well, but yeah, this is really bad for your health, and the incidence of getting lung cancer as a smoker is way more than as a non-smoker, and there are all these bad things associated with it. It's expensive. It doesn't smell good. It's just bad for, it's just on and on and on. You lay it all out for them like that, which I think most smokers have to already know this. And then they say, yeah, but I'm still going to smoke. I like it. I enjoy it. What do you do at that point? Is the behavior irrational, even though their beliefs they're agreeing with what we've said is their evidence? They might even say, yeah, I know that I believe that this is really harmful for me. And you would say, well, then why do you do something that you know and admit is really harmful for you? And they say, it's a kind of calculated risk on their part. They're willing to incur that in order to continue doing something that they enjoy. But again, maybe it's starting to sound more and more like irrational thinking or irrational behavior. I don't know. Addictions are hard. That's a tough case. Those are tough cases. Whether it be, regardless of what it is, it's just the idea of compulsive behavior. It doesn't seem to respond very well to reason. And there aren't a lot of, when you think about psychotherapy-wise in terms of treatments, cognitive behavioral therapy, that's kind of the go-to. That's the gold standard for a lot of this stuff, trying to make the individual aware of the thoughts, the feelings, the reasons, and then they can change the programming, change the behavior. The success rate, I don't know. I'm not a psychotherapist, but I would imagine that it's kind of hit or miss. Probably a lot of individual variation and a lot of commitment to sticking to the regimen. But interesting stuff to think about. So this is the people are irrational argument that we're supposed to get, and as I say, it's missing some quantifiers, and there's a certain amount of kind of laxity to this in terms of what would count as significantly irrational. We're at the end. I'll stop with that, and then we'll look at two arguments the next time, and we'll start thinking about Chapter 9 as well. Thanks, folks.